Munich, November 1912. Halfway through lunch, the man who invented psychoanalysis slides off his chair and hits the floor. The younger man at the table carries him to a couch. As Freud opens his eyes, he says, "How sweet it must be to die." It is the second time he has fainted in front of this man. Within a year, they will never speak again. Sigmund Freud, 56, Vienna, father of a movement that taught the world its mind is not its own. Carl Jung. 37, Zurich, the most brilliant psychiatrist in Europe, and the man Freud has publicly named his successor and crown prince. 6 years of letters, 700 pages of them, and it ends with a man on a restaurant floor. It began 5 years earlier in a room on Berggasse in Vienna. Jung arrived at 1 in the afternoon to meet the older man, whose book on dreams he had defended when defending it was career suicide. They talked without stopping for 13 hours. Neither could remember afterwards whether they had eaten at all. Freud was 51 and surrounded by devoted Viennese disciples, and he wanted none of them. He wanted this one. Psychoanalysis, he wrote, risked being dismissed as a Jewish national affair, and Vienna was already sharpening that knife. A Swiss pastor's son at its head would make it a science instead of a sect. Jung was chosen in part for the shape of his name. Jung was not a disciple looking for a master. At the Burghölzli asylum in Zurich, he had built something Freud never had: proof. He read patients a list of words and timed their answers with a stopwatch, and when the pause stretched, he had found the buried thing. He called those buried things complexes. You still use the word. One of those patients was a 19-year-old Russian girl who arrived screaming and left cured, brilliant, and in love with her doctor. Jung slept with her. Then frightened, he wrote to Vienna to get ahead of the story. So did she. From that day, Freud held something over his crown prince and never once put it down. August 1909. The two of them are in Bremen, about to sail for America together. Over lunch, Jung will not stop talking about the bog bodies of northern Germany, the ones the peat keeps perfect for 2,000 years. Freud asks him 3 times why he is so concerned with corpses. Then Freud faints. He came round convinced of something he would not say out loud for years. That Jung wanted him dead, 7 days at sea, spent analysing each other's dreams. Then Jung asked for one private detail to finish an interpretation, and Freud stopped. "I cannot risk my authority," he said. Jung wrote later, at that moment he lost it. Worcester, Massachusetts. Clark University hands them both honorary degrees, and America, which had never heard of any of this, listens to 5 lectures and changes its mind about the human mind. They are lined up on the steps for a photograph. Freud sits in the front row. Jung sits beside him. It is the best day they will ever have together. On the voyage home, Jung told Freud a dream. He was in a house. The upper floor was elegant and modern. Below it, the rooms got older and older until a stone stair went down into a cave cut out of rock. On the floor of the cave, in the dust, lay 2 human skulls. Freud only wanted to know one thing. Whose skulls? Whose death do you secretly wish for? Jung looked at the man who had already fainted once over corpses, decided the truth was too dangerous, and lied. "My wife's," he said, "and his sister-in-law's." Freud was visibly relieved. The heir had just learned he could not tell his father the truth. What Jung actually thought the dream meant was the thing that would break them. Not his wife. The house was a skull itself. Floor below floor below floor, every layer older than the man standing in it, down to something shared by everybody who has ever lived. He would spend 40 years calling that cave the collective unconscious. Freud had one law, and it was not negotiable. The engine underneath everything a human being does is sexual. Jung had spent years in a locked ward with people whose visions had nothing to do with sex, and he could not make the law fit. So he did the one thing a crown prince must never do. He wrote it down. Freud saw it coming. He took Jung aside and asked him to promise never to abandon the sexual theory, to make it a dogma, an unshakable bulwark. Against what? Jung asked. Against the black tide of mud, Freud said, of occultism. Jung heard a scientist asking him to stop being a scientist, and something in him closed for good. 1912. Jung publishes a book that widens the whole idea. The drive underneath us is not only sexual, it is the raw energy of being alive, and it speaks in myths older than any of us. He knew what the second half of that book would cost him. He said so. It cost me my friendship with Freud. Then came the smallest insult in the history of psychology. Freud travelled to Switzerland to visit a sick colleague at Kreuzlingen, 60 kilometres from Zurich, and did not come to see Jung. Jung found out from someone else. For the rest of their lives, both men would refer to it bitterly as the Kreuzlingen Gesture. Which brings us back to that restaurant in Munich. The table is arguing about a pharaoh who chiselled his father's name off every monument in Egypt. Jung says the young king was doing his own work, not attacking his father. Freud hears a son explaining why erasing a father is healthy. And Freud goes down. Jung carried him. He said afterwards that Freud was surprisingly light, and that as he laid him on the sofa, the old man looked at him the way a child looks at whoever is holding it. Then Freud said it again. How sweet it must be to die. 2 months later, the letters turn into knives. Jung accuses Freud of treating his followers like patients, of turning every disagreement into a symptom. Freud replies that he proposes they abandon their personal relations entirely. Nobody loses anything, he writes. Jung answers with 6 words from Hamlet and never writes again. The rest is silence. In 1914, Jung resigns as president of the international association Freud built for him, and walks out of the movement he was supposed to inherit. The Viennese circle closes behind him like water. In their official history, he becomes a mistake, a defector, a man who could not handle the truth about sex. Cut loose from the only man who understood his work, Jung came apart. In October 1913, he saw, wide awake, a flood swallowing all of Europe between the North Sea and the Alps, and the water turning red. The vision came back again and again. He was certain he was going mad. 9 months later, the war began. So he did what Freud would have called a breakdown, and he called an experiment. He wrote the visions down, then copied them by hand into a folio bound in red leather, in medieval script, with painted illuminations. He worked on it for 16 years. His family kept it in a bank vault until 2009. Then he bought land on the edge of a lake and started building a tower out of stone, by hand, with no electricity and no running water in it, ever. He carved faces into the rock outside. Freud spent those years in a consulting room. Jung spent them building a body for his own mind. Freud kept the movement and kept losing sons to it. Adler gone, Steckel gone, Rank gone, each one excommunicated in turn. In 1923, they cut a cancer out of his jaw. There would be more than 30 operations and a prosthesis wedged between his mouth and his nose that he could barely speak through. He called it the monster. 1938. The Nazis take Vienna, burn his books, and hold his daughter for a day. To buy his way out, he signs a paper saying he was treated respectfully. The story goes he asked to add one line. I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone. He reached London, had his couch shipped after him, and asked his doctor for morphine 3 weeks into the war Jung had foreseen. Jung outlived him by 22 years, and that is not a clean victory. In the 30s, he took the presidency of a psychotherapy society reorganized under the Nazis, and published an essay separating Aryan from Jewish psychology. He later called it a slip and the worst mistake of his life. Historians have argued about it ever since. And here is what the two of them left in your mouth. Ego, denial, repressed, a Freudian slip. Those are his: introvert, extrovert, complex, archetype. Those are Jung's. Every time you explain yourself to somebody, You reach for one man's vocabulary or the other's, and you almost never notice which side you just picked. A father who could not be contradicted and a son who could not stop. Between them they cut the human mind in half, and it has never been put back together. So whose side are you on? Freud, who said we are driven by what we want and will not admit? Or Jung, who said we are driven by something far older than us? Tell me in the comments. If you would have sided differently, hit like and subscribe. A new Feud opens the file every week. Next time, two queens, cousins who never once met face to face, wrote to each other for 19 years. And one of them signed the order that took the other one's head off. Elizabeth versus Mary. The file is already open.